Welcome. Today's a very special day. We are filming an inaugural episode of The Fraternity. Normally, the three of us are in the studio and recording for a Stern Talk. But today we're pivoting to a project that is very near and dear to our hearts. It's a new partnership between the three of us, and it's called The Fraternity. You can learn more by going to www.jointhefraternity.com. It's an online coaching platform, and it's an online community for small business owners who are at 6, 7, 8 figures in revenue, and they're trying to get 9 figures and above. It's a community of like-minded individuals that want to share and network, share resources, and learn how to grow and scale their business. And so again, for more information, I encourage you to go to www.jointhefraternity.com. We meet every Thursday at 4 p.m. Pacific time for a 1-hour Zoom. So without further ado, I want to introduce the topics that we're going to be talking about today. Really and truly what we want to do in these episodes, right? We want to offer a free webinar. And while we're not necessarily going to do that perfectly today, I think what the three of us are going to try to do is we're going to try to give you an introduction to a module that we think that business owners, entrepreneurs, even intrapreneurs are going to eat up and are going to love. So without further ado, James Newton, you've been working with the two largest CEO think tanks for the last 30 years. And I'm always curious, you're on stage, you're in front of thousands of people, you introduce yourself, you introduce the work, but then what's the first step that you take to engage with the audience to build their commitment, their buy-in?
Well, the talks that I do aren't with thousands of people, not that I haven't done keynotes with thousands of people, but in think tank work, these are smaller groups that tend to be 10 to 20 people per group, right? So that the notion would be that none of us are as smart as all of us. You get into larger groups, there's no way to reach everybody in the group for them, and so it becomes a different kind of challenge. Critical to success in almost any endeavor, it's a primary leadership skill, is to know how to set the context. I don't know where this quote came from, but I've heard it over the years a lot. A great speaker tells you what they're going to tell you. Then they tell you. Then they tell you what they told you. And I think that my job over the last 30 years has had a lot in working with these groups, has had a lot to do with how do I help them find something of real value in this 3 or 4 hour presentation that makes a difference in their lives and gets them more and more committed to what I would call reflection. Okay. So we have a tendency to start out on the downside. Meaning, there's a saying in Vistage. Vistage is where you come to get your answers questioned. Not every CEO wants to have their answers questioned. There's lots of CEOs think they have all the answers. That's a very different model. That's quite a different model, authoritarian model, if you will. Sure. The difference is that we're going in there with a learning mindset, wanting to learn, wanting to be open, how to address our issues. And so diving down into the deeper issues is a place to start. So I'll often start by asking the group, I'll say, I'll tell you what I'd like to do to get to know you a little bit. I'd like to start over here, and we go around the arc and tell me what your company does. How long you've been a member of the organization here, and what's your biggest weakness as a leader? And what I want you in weakness as a leader, personally about you, and go, if you will, what I'd ask you to do is see if you can't go a layer deeper. For example, very commonly I hear somebody say, well, I'm a terrible delegator. If they were to go a layer deeper, what might they say?
I'm a control freak.
I have a real issue with control. I'm a control freak. Yeah. That's going deeper. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And there's a level of vulnerability in that you're exposing that, And I say, so let me ask you a question. And I ask of the whole group, did your respect go up or down when he just said that? And everybody says up. I say, up? He just told you he's a control freak. Why did your respect for him go up? Well, because he's being honest. He's being open.
Right.
And that's a key to real professional development.
Right.
A key. And so I actually learned this. I was working with a group, first time I'd ever worked with them. I had 2 days, 2 groups, back to back with the same facilitator who ran both groups. And he comes to me before we start and he says, is there a question you'd like to ask the group to begin with? And I thought about it and I said, yeah, let's ask them what's the biggest weakness as a leader? And people kind of, and we got great content, it turned out. Just that having people dive in and open up right away was wonderful. And lots of work to do right there, just with that on the table. And the next morning, he says to me, yesterday was great. I love that, asking that question and the responses. I mean, everybody talked about it in the afternoon after you'd gone, about how valuable it was. And he said, same question. I said, yeah, that worked great. And so he steps up front and he says, and James would like to know, what's your biggest challenge as a leader? That's not the same question.
They're two different.
Yeah. That's 2 different questions. What's your biggest weakness as a leader? We get responses that have to do with what's going on inside. Yeah. Here's who I am. Here's what I struggle with. Biggest challenge as a leader, my COO. It's something.
It's internal versus external. Right?
Internal versus external.
Right, absolutely.
In fact, in business, there's a very well-known exercise that if you're in business, you really want to know this exercise inside and out. We will do a module on it, but it's called a SWOT analysis, and it's SWOT, a SWOT analysis: strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So strengths and weaknesses, that's all about internal to the company. What are we good at, and where do we have weaknesses? And to do a really honest, open assessment of that. As you can imagine, in team building, that's key, is that we've got to have the courage to get really open and talk about how we contributed to the problems or issues or it not working. Opportunities and threats have more to do with the marketplace. Well, with interest rates being high like they are right now, or the environment on restrictions of environmental issues, et cetera, are tougher now, or those are opportunities and threats. And by the way, quite commonly, the threats have embedded in them what the opportunities really are. So it's a wonderful, wonderful exercise. And a lot of these exercises have to do with us narrowing down what we're focused on so that we can be more effective in resolving what it is that's going on there.
And James, just to make sure for the audience, when you talk about the question of challenges for a leader, is it okay for the leader to express those things as external to them?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And of course, that's not the question, what's your biggest weakness, but is there time for that? You bet. In fact, that's one of the things that that these groups spend a lot of time doing, because the members bring the issue to the group, the notion being none of us are as smart as all of us. And so they bring the issue to the group. And interestingly, I'm 76 years old.
That's it?
That's it. And when I turned 60, I went through an exercise. I took some time and stopped and did inventory, looked back over the course of my life. And the biggest insight I came out of it with was recognizing that at every major intersection, I had more choice available to me than I was aware of at the time. I try to remember that now. Right, because I inevitably today, when I'm looking at something, I'm thinking I have more choice than I'm seeing right now.
I think it's a brilliant point. I think as a CEO, as a leader inside of an organization, you can have this inward mindset, or you can have an external mindset. An internal mindset is where you're just focused on self and you treat people as objects, right? where you're not necessarily seeing them as part of the decision-making process. But if you can be a conscious leader, right, and you can ask people for support and for feedback, then you have this external mindset where, again, you're not objectifying people. You're open and curious about what they have to offer insofar as their opinions, right, on the subject. And then if you go to them, right, you realize, like you said, that you have more choices. I think that's true in a professional setting, but it's also true in a personal setting, right?
Right.
With people's spouses. And
so in these groups, you know, a member presents an issue and the rest of the members, they don't want to jump straight to solution. The first thing they want to do is get an understanding of what's really going on.
Right.
And a lot of times what happens very commonly is somebody says, I'm trying to decide, do I do this or I do that? And the group says, well, before we work on that, tell us what's going on. And they ask some questions about it. Well, in my company, we had something similar. What we did was this. And another one says, yeah, we went this way. And the next thing you know, it's instead of just black and white or this or that, there's a whole plethora of choices available. And sometimes you can have your cake and eat it too. And that's the value of a think tank, okay, is essentially to create a synergy where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
you know what this reminds me of? The book by the Arbinger Institute, Leadership and Self-Deception. I don't mean to take us off task with what the two seem so intertwined because leaders so often fall into this paradigm where, again, it's self-deception. They believe that these are the choices they can go to because they're the only ones who can solve problems, right? And I think,
and in fact, James is already at a huge advantage being in front of these two think tanks, Vistage and YPO or WPO, because the folks that are in there have some understanding that they do have more choices than they might realize. But so many business owners out there haven't even realized that they have this choice set available to them. And that's why the fraternity is so important.
Oh, dynamite. What do I owe you for saying that's amazing, Robin? But I think it's true, right? And I do wonder, James, you know, you're facilitating these organizations, these think tanks for the last 30 years. Do all of them come curious and open-minded to have their answers questioned? Or do some of them go there because they're sent there? Do some of them go there to spy on competitors and other companies? Or could you say, like, as a whole, these leaders are coming there open-minded and mindful and curious, childlike and not childish and open to feedback from others? Or is it just like you see people put up walls and it's like you have to spend an enormous amount of time breaking down these walls?
It's a good question. I'm not sure how many groups there are within Vistage, but there are a lot of forums, if you will. Mm-hmm. And as you might expect, it's a bell curve. You know, some are pretty mediocre, and it's a big investment of time and money, and I'm not sure why they spend the money.
Right.
But most, the average, the norm, clearly gets value, that they become very close to one another, deeply connected because of that vulnerability. That's a natural side effect of people being open and vulnerable, is connection and brotherhood, sisterhood. You know, that blend. It's interesting as we go along over the years. I've watched more and more women come into the think tanks, which has really added value.
Yeah.
And
otherwise, it's a male echo chamber.
Yeah, exactly.
Overflowing with useless testosterone.
So, but it's Jim Collins wrote a book, From Good to Great.
Yeah.
And his group studied, I think, 493 companies and determined that 11 of them had made the journey from being a good company to being a great company. Interestingly, several of those are no longer on that list. But
yeah, like some of the pharmacies that
meaning that it's not a static thing. You don't just get there and that's it. You're done. It's a constant process. You know.
Indeed.
But what I've gotten to do in these think tanks is I've gotten to do a study a lot like what Jim Collins did. And I can see that there are some groups that the average of a Vistage group is far ahead of the norm in society. right?
That's a great point.
If you look at other companies in the same business that don't have that kind of support system, Vistage will outperform them.
Yeah.
And true of YPO as well, for sure, right? So this think tank model has proven, and both of them are 70 years old or so they've been around a long time and well proven, right? Expensive, well proven, great investment, right?
Right.
What I've gotten to do is do my own exploration. Who are the ultra high performance groups, and what is it that they have in common? And one of the things, the primary thing that is the differentiator is self-disclosure. I mean, the people in those really high performing groups have learned to be very self-disclosing, very open with one another. Also, in the leadership style, I would say you find more Socratic leadership.
Tell us about what that means.
What means?
Socratic.
Socratic. Yeah.
Okay.
Like
Tell me more.
Yeah. I was like, well, you want to hear about this?
Yeah.
Yeah. Of course, Socrates was the father of education. Most people think of him as a philosopher, but he's really the father of education. And one of the questions I'll ask in any of these groups early on is I'll say, are any of you attorneys? And a couple of them will raise their hand and say, okay, I don't want to hear from you. Okay, you don't get to answer here. The rest of you, any of you know what it means to be a Socratic leader or a Socratic facilitator? Sometimes somebody will, but a lot of times nobody knows, And so say, okay, so you're an attorney, right? What does it mean to be Socratic leader? And they'll say right away, to lead by asking questions. Well, why do attorneys know this? Because all attorneys were taught the Socratic method. The justice system is based on the Socratic method of asking questions. We've all watched enough television shows where somebody's sitting on the witness stand, and here's the attorney on the floor, and the one sitting back listening to the attorney on the floor says, "Is there a question here?" Meaning, it's got to be framed as a question. That's how this works.
Right.
So Socratic leaders, William, you come out, so you work for me, and you come in and you say, what should I do about such and such? I say, I want you to do this, 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 and that. And you say, got it. And off you go, right?
Absolutely.
Of course, later I find out that you didn't got it.
Yeah.
And why didn't you got it? You didn't got it because you didn't ask any questions. And by the way, I didn't ask any questions. And so, and so often there's that failure to communicate, right? Why not ask questions? Sometimes people feel afraid. They're intimidated by the boss. They don't want to look foolish or embarrassed, and the boss winds up making all the decisions. Now, by the way, this is the same group. I'll ask them, how many of you are often frustrated that people don't take more accountability, more ownership? All the hands go up. I say, do you think there might be a connection between being the answer person and people not taking accountability? In other words, if I'm going to make all the decisions, why should you do the heavy lifting of thinking for yourself?
That's right.
And then when we have a real issue, there's an old saying, when you really need a friend, it's too late to make one.
You know what this reminds me of? When I was a child, my mother called me and said, I'll be home in 30 minutes. We're going to have spaghetti for dinner. I want you to put a pot of water up. So guess what I did? I got a pot, I filled it with water, and I put it on the stove. 30 minutes later, Mom comes home, ready to put the pasta into the pot of what she hoped was
hot water.
Yeah, boiling water. And guess what? No. And that is the anecdote of so many business owners.
So was she angry with you?
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Surprisingly, right? So who should she have been angry with?
Absolutely. She should be mindful and open and curious, and she should ask questions.
But there's frustration in the whole system, and it's right. It's right. So let's.
She didn't hold herself responsible for her communication.
She does. She does.
Let's try a retake.
Yeah.
So you come and you say, James, what should I do about this? Or maybe I say, hey, William, come on in here.
Right.
Well, I want you to do this, 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 and that. Got it. Whoa, wait a second. Before you go, Play it back to me. Tell me what you heard. And so, well, you told me you want me to do this, 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 and this. Well, actually, it was this, 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 and that. Let's talk about that. And it's in the asking questions. What should I do about such and such? A good question. What should you do about it? Well, I don't know. That's why I'm asking you. Well, if you were in my position, what would be your concerns? What would be your considerations? You can put your cards right on the table. What I really am, I need to, especially if you're like in a management position, part of my job is to replace myself, because if I can replace myself, it means this company is growing. And and that means helping to empower you. So I'm going to ask you lots of questions. And I'm not asking you not to come to me with questions. I love you coming with questions. I'm just saying I'm going to bounce those questions back at you.
Yeah.
And because so that you're really thinking for yourself. And what happens when you start saying, you come and you say, what should I do about Sunday? Good question. What should you do? I'm going to hear responses that I wouldn't have come up with. And that helps me stay green and growing. And so that helps me stay more connected, and that process of developing the people who come and work for us. And by the way, when people feel like they're making a difference, they put 100% in. And so there's a synergy that gets created in becoming a Socratic leader.
And what you discussed ties so well into the book, Leadership and Self-Deception.
Absolutely.
Because what you're describing is being in the box or out of the box, seeing people as objects, and also ties into consciousness, right? And being non-reactive, and non-triggered.
Yeah,
in your communication.
Not so hookable, right?
Yeah.
The talk that I've given for years in these groups is called Visionary Leadership. And there's a tagline to it: becoming a non-anxious presence in an anxious system. And we live in a chronically anxious system. And so as we do this work,
24-hour news cycle. This just in.
Yeah, this just in. And as we become more conscious, we become less anxious. As we become more conscious, we're less reactive, less hookable, less triggerable. And so we live with a deeper level of satisfaction and joy and connection and freedom in our lives. And those are big stakes to be playing for.
Yeah.
And when we understand that and how to get to that and can teach that in our organizations, we have a tremendous amount of loyalty, performance. That's what it's about.
Because that's what all leaders want. They want to breed other leaders, ideally, right? If you were to ask them, right? They want to breed other leaders. They want people to be accountable. They're just not sure how to leverage the tools that they really and truly have, right? But it's just helping them to discover that these tools exist. It's sitting in a toolbox right here.
Yeah. That book, Leadership and Self-Deception, the Arbinger Institute should be sending me a commission check.
That's right. Yeah.
Because I have been using it for the last several years, really recommending to all of these groups, get the book and read it. And in fact, a lot of times when I'm doing a 2 or 3 day organizational seminar, I'll ask that everybody read the book before they come in. And what it basically, it's a simple kind of book, and it's fun to read because it's done like a story. But what I love about it is it shows how you can be really intelligent, but being intelligent is no guarantee that you're highly conscious. And when the tagline is, it's leadership and self-deception, getting out of the box. And the tagline is getting out of the box. When we're in the box and we all spend time being hooked, angry, resentful, blameful, fearful, we inevitably use our intelligence to justify and rationalize our position. When we're out of the box and our minds are open, our hearts are open, our lives work at a qualitatively higher level. We become not just smart, we become wise.
Yeah. And so many entrepreneurs and business owners who are listening to this are thinking, well, okay, that's great. I'm going to be out of the box. I'm going to be conscious. I'm going to build emotional bank accounts with my employees. But how do I tell them that I hate what they're doing and they're doing a bad job? How do I give them that criticism that I really want to give them? It sounds like you guys are just living in this kumbaya world of positivity. But I got to tell people that they screwed up.
Absolutely. In fact, I would say there's more willingness in an organization that has done the kind of work to become more conscious, a lot more willingness to face into the issues.
Yeah.
Okay.
And this is the Jung part, right?
Well, it's young, but in business terms, one of the best places to look is in Jim Collins' book, From Good to Great, where he talks about doing what he calls postmortems. In other words, let's go back and take a look at this issue and let's talk about it and see what we can learn from it. And, a mistake is an unlearned lesson. And so really wise companies value the mistakes. Since we've paid for it, let's make sure we get the lessons. And so it's hard to do a postmortem in a company that hasn't done this deeper work because they want to go to blame. They're always looking for somebody to blame. And that's such a killer. It's so much, it creates such toxicity, and there's so much fear around it, fear of being judged, fear of being blamed.
So James, is learning and blame, are those opposites?
Are they opposites?
Is that the other side of the coin from learning, is blaming?
Well, I would say they're related, and in some ways I'd say they're opposites. I would say the opposite of blame is acceptance.
Let me go to Dean's question and see if I can give an answer that I think might satisfy you. So if you're an entrepreneur, you're a business owner, and you're watching this podcast, sure, you're hearing all these adages and, creative, clever sayings. You're like, that sounds great. And these are all dopamine hits.
Feels
right?
so good.
Right.
Feels so good, right?
Yeah.
But you're like, you finish the podcast, somebody walks into your office, says, boss, we just lost our second best customer. And you're like, right? So immediately you would go to blame. For organizations that have done this deep work, right? This the stuff that we've gone through at Cardiff and the stuff that we recommend organizations do. If that was to happen inside of our organization, you've built an emotional bank account with the person that's walked into the room and says, boss, we just lost our second best customer. You have, and I don't want to word this incorrectly because the secret to the universe is knowing the true names of things. But if you have an emotional bank account with that person, and there have been constant and meaningful deposits into this emotional bank account with that individual, they'll let you slide a little bit, right? You'll say something like, all right, can we get messy here? And they'll buy in. They'll say, yeah, let's get messy. All right, why do you think we lost it, right?
I love that. So you're saying that as a leader, you're allowed to be messy.
I think you can introduce, right?
Yeah.
You can introduce it and say like, all right, sit down, shut the door, let's talk about this, right? Don't immediately, if you've done this deep work, you don't immediately go to blame. You go to doing a post-mortem on what's happened, right? You ask for permission to get messy, right? They buy in, you have this emotional bank account that you've built over time, and then there's a dialogue. Go ahead. You were going to say something.
No, I'm tracking with you. I think perfectly. It's yes.
Yeah.
Edwin Friedman was a rabbi, a family therapist, a brilliant author and teacher of leaders. He died in the 90s, I think, but he wrote a couple of books. One of the books is called Generation to Generation. Amazing book.
Lador Vador.
But Friedman had an enormous impact on my life. I spent a lot of time involved with the Leadership Institute of Seattle. And Friedman was all over that institute, all over the organization. He was one of the voices that we heard a lot. And the tagline, becoming a non-anxious presence in an anxious system, that is the tagline to my workshop that I've done for so many years, I lifted from Friedman.
Yeah.
Okay? Here's a quote from Edwin Friedman. I love this quote. In any situation, the individual best able to describe reality without blame will emerge as the leader, whether designated or not. That's a very powerful statement. In any situation, the individual best able to describe reality without blame will emerge as the leader, whether designated or not. We've all been in a situation that's charged and contentious and about to boil over into conflict and confrontation. And somebody leans forward and says, now, wait a second. Here's what's going on. And they very effectively describe reality. And there's no blame in it whatsoever. The charge in the room dissipates and disappears. The attention goes to that person who just described reality. And the question is, okay, now what? What next? Where do we go from here? And the Leadership Institute of Seattle used to say, it's not what you do that counts. It's what you do next.
Yeah, that's right.
So
that's absolutely right.
That notion of describing reality without blame. So that when that becomes part of your style as a leader, is to not go to blame, is to go to let's describe reality. What can we do? For one, a customer who's got an issue that's well handled is more loyal than the customer who's never had an issue in the first place. We all know that.
Absolutely.
Today. And so, this non-blamefulness. If you have kids, there's a wonderful book by Stephen Glenn called Raising Self-Reliant Kids. Raising Self-Reliant Children in a Self-Indulgent World. That's the title.
I should read that a few times.
It's a great management book. It's a great management
James,
book.
can I poke a little bit at the blame topic? So we all blame, right? Every day we know we're doing it, and we'd love to stop. But it feels so good to be right. I just really, really want to be right. I'm right. And so I blame. Where does that come from? How do you deal with it?
Boy. Actually, I've made quite a good living working on dealing with that. I'd be homeless if it weren't for blame.
That's right.
I would say step by step. I mean, we're all forgetful. We all backslide into these things. What I do when I catch myself blaming or I catch myself getting hooked, as quickly as I can, I want to get back to being conscious and mining this for the learning. I mean, if you want to be highly conscious, then you've got to do the work, and that means learning how to process yourself and be honest with yourself.
And why, as a human, why do I want to be right? Is it a protection mechanism?
Sometimes, often, it's certainly ego-based. I think that
it's the intellect protecting you, right?
Remember Happy Days?
I love
Happy Remember Happy Days and the Fonz,
Yeah, sure.
And the Fonz, if he made a mistake, he was big enough to admit it. He would say, hey, I was not right. He could never get the word wrong to come out of his mouth. And it was a little play on this. It actually feels hollow sometimes when you wake up about that one. It's like, I have a very dear friend who does relationship workshops, and she says, you can be right or you can have a relationship that works.
In finance, right, we learned the phrase from Ken Fisher, right? You can be right or you can be rich. You can't be both.
Yeah.
I think this is the whole point of consciousness, which is like being highly self-actualized, highly individuated, having, emotional intelligence. But to your question, what do you do when your ego immediately takes over the helm, the wheel, and immediately goes to blame? I think is a great question for both personal growth and for professional growth.
Yeah.
This is where you immediately go to if you haven't done the work. And a lot of times, even if you have done the work, you go to blame. But I think the point is that if you have that emotional bank account, right? If you have that relationship with those deposits, then you go, can I talk to you real quick?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
15 minutes ago, we had this discussion and I immediately went to blame. And I want to fix things because I'm embarrassed with how I acted. I let my ego take control.
Wow. Yeah. What huge deposits in that emotional bank account.
Yeah.
And by the way, that means if you as the leader can be wrong,
Right. It gives them permission.
that gives me some permission. I don't have to be perfect. And Jack Stack, who wrote the book, The Great Game of Business, talked about that being a turning point in his company, which is one of those poster childs for a turnaround in a company. He took over Springfield Remanufacturing and he turned it around by his own vulnerability, by exactly the way you just said it.
It's interesting. You can do it with children. You can make the mistake with children and then go back and say, hey, I'm not proud of the way I acted. And again, it's giving them permission to make that mistake, but to go back and correct it. You were going to say something.
So it's learning to, I think part of it is I catch myself blaming. It's learning to look for what I can validate. And also, if we constantly need to be right, the ego is very involved, inevitably. And there's a strategy that over time begins to develop, which is what we call counterpoint or crazy maker. It's a strategy designed to work you over in your logic. It's sophisticated nitpicking. It's right, wrong thinking. And after a while, people don't want to be around that strategy. And so, we lose people and we don't know why they went away. They went away because they were tired of life as a debate format,
And this is the problem with great companies, with challenged leaders that haven't done this deep work. And then they lose people, right? And it's just this constant revolving door. And how many times have you heard talking to other CEOs where they're like, if I only had the marketing and sales team that XYZ company has, oh boy, we would be a high-performing organization.
And then this ties perfectly into being right? Because being right is a false idol.
Yeah, exactly.
It's hollow.
Exactly. It's a false idol.
And that false idol potentially accumulates a lot of wealth, a lot of money, a lot of excellent numbers on the P&L. But what you see around you is that your family's falling apart and that your enterprise is a revolving door of people. Right. And so it's almost like you see the people closest to you just disappearing one after the other after the other.
Because they're objects.
But your bank account may not reflect that. And that's why it's a false idol.
Yeah.
That's a great point.
Yeah. And, I used to, when I did personal growth seminars, I used to do a lecture on the two strategies, one being more female, one being more male. And Freud, by the way, or not Freud, excuse me, Jung wrote a lot about anima and animus. Anima being a female principle, animus being masculine principle. And the notion that, and that actually was his deepest work, was us getting in touch with those aspects within ourselves and integrating. To integrate, which is what we do as we become more conscious. To integrate, the word integrate comes from the word integrity. My favorite definition of integrity is the state of being whole or complete. So I would say some of these strategies tend to be more masculine, some more feminine, right? As what Jung found is as people individuated, they tended to integrate those traits and characteristics, became more whole. Which is in a sense, when we talk about becoming more conscious, it's really about becoming more whole, more our authentic selves. And there's something magical that happens with people and their interactions with life and each other when they're in that place of acceptance.
Yeah. Recently someone discovered that there's a worship gene in humans. Have you heard about this?
Mm-mm. So I'd love to hear it.
So someone discovered that there's a worship gene in our DNA, and some are able to turn it off and some keep it on. And I would say, going back to Dean's point about CEOs with big bank accounts, but small emotional bank accounts, large companies, but large companies with a revolving door, I think they've got the worship gene turned off, right? And again, right, I don't want to use the same word because you used worshiping a false idol, but the truth is that they're worshiping themselves.
in a sense. Okay.
Well,
And let me
sure, please.
So, I mean, this is venturing maybe somewhat off of our
Yeah,
subject,
because we were talking about blame.
but you were talking, but you brought in this thing of selves, right? And
Yeah.
you know, and if you study some of the great mystics, they inevitably had a kind of agreed there were two aspects of self. There was ego-based self, which was usually depicted with a small s, and then true self with a capital S. So here's a quote with a small s. So why are you unhappy? Because 99% of everything you say and do is for yourself, and there isn't one. Here's another one, capital S. You have forgotten yourself, and that is your only fault. So the work, in a sense, of authenticity is becoming who you really are. And you have the inside edge on that because nobody's quite as qualified to be you as you are, you know. But that notion of deeper levels of self-acceptance cause us to, and which means that we have a deeper relationship with reality, right? And as a result, the quality of our life is enhanced. So not only are we, financially successful, we're successful holistically in all ways.
I hear you. I think and we can close on this point. I think for some leaders, they struggle with the idea that they've created the enterprise, and not only do they objectify others with this internal mindset, right? Treating people as objects and not being open and curious and mindful to their beliefs and their emotions, but they start to objectify themselves, right? They see themselves as the reason that they've achieved this wealth and this success, right? But they're not open and mindful and curious, and they're not highly self-actualized. They don't realize that they too themselves are a person. They are not their company. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Yeah.
And blame is just as harmful when it's external as it is when it's internal.
That's a brilliant point. It's a brilliant point because you can't love others if you don't love yourself.
Where it all starts.
Right. Gosh.
Good
stuff.
Yeah.
Really
I mean,
good stuff.
we're venturing around here on this. If I have a goal in this work, which I do, which is to help people find inspiration to this journey of transformation, to come to self-awareness.
Right.
When Daniel Goleman at Harvard, 1995, he authored the book Emotional Intelligence.
Right.
Today, most of us know that term. And probably the number one trait of people with a high EQ, a high emotional intelligence, is self-awareness. And that's a lifelong journey. Although I will say for most people, if they really get committed, 2 or 3 years before they're walking on the planet with a different state of being. And some people are on this planet living here like it's hell, and other people are here on this planet living with it like this is an amazing, amazing experience, And
it's the lens in which you see life through. You can be standing next to someone who's anxious and angry and frightened, right? And then you can be happy as a clam. You're both seeing the same, version of reality, but they're interpreting it through a completely different lens.
You're running companies in the same industry,
right,
in the same city.
Yeah. I don't think
hopefully
it's
that's relatable.
Right.
I would say, though, in fairness to this whole journey, is that we're not always happy, Sure. And I think that that isn't about always being happy. It's about being whole and real and honest. By the way, honesty, H-O-N, one in Latin, est, is. To be at one with what is what is honesty. So, to be at one with the truth.
Yeah. Well, let's end on this point, because I think it's a fair point. You don't always have to be happy. You just have to be honest with the truth. And the truth is that there's just today and there's just now. so that the anger of the past is just as false as the anxiety of what's to come in the future. And so many business owners get trapped into this paradigm where they're focused on losing the best customer. That happened 2 years ago, but they're still carrying the backpack of anger from 2 years ago. Or they're sitting on the toilet or in the shower and they're sitting there for 45 minutes and they're thinking about, or they're dwelling on the anxiety of what's going to happen in the future. So the point is that you can be in the now and that you have more choices at your disposal than you probably realize, but you won't get there, one, without doing the work, but two, seeking external outside counsel, being open and curious.
Yeah, you can't do it all on your own.
No.
And if you enjoyed what you heard today, please go to jointhefraternity.com and join us, the three of us, in our journey to help you be a more conscious leader.
I think we got to end it as there needs to be a change in the branding. We need to call it the think tank, right? It needs to be not a coaching platform, not a community, right? It needs to be a think tank because we want to be open, right?
Well, let's work on it.
We'll work on it.
You got suggestions? Give us some suggestions.
Put them in the notes down below.
Yeah.
We'll see you guys next time.
All
Thank you.
righty. Take care.